Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Did you get one, Peter? One thing I always want to make sure we do, come on, just give me, is remember that trade's big right now. We're starting a panel on trade, and I want you to use your Milken tools for sharing information about it. So we're gonna tweet this out right now, and make sure you do it as well. You get your opportunity to tweet out what's happening on these panels. We just got a nice picture of this group, and it's really this simple. The hash is hashtag #MIGlobal and at Milken Institute, and there it is. We're out in the world.
Great.
I want to thank you all for coming. This is great for us. For all of us who have been in the trade community for some of us for decades now, it's fun to come here and see a room out because most trade geeks have been toiling in anonymity for years, and now we're on the president tweets about it, world leaders are tweeting about it, we're on television, in front pages of newspapers, podcasts, all talking about trade. In fact, for the first time, trade is cool, and we don't have to be huddled in cornered rooms anymore talking about trade. Some of it, I'm going to talk a little bit just off the top here, just a minute, just a little bit of a scene setter for us on trade, and introduce the panel. So we are having our day in trade, and part of that is for reasons that trade has been viewed as disruptive. We note here in Brexit, part of the story with the UK and the EU and Brexit is the trade relationship between the UK and the world and relative to the EU. We saw it in the presidential elections in stark light, with both presidential candidates actually talking about problems with the United States and NAFTA, a trade agreement that we negotiated, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, threatening to pull out. President Trump eventually did pull out of TPP, renegotiated NAFTA. We're going to get into some of that today. And we're talking about the trade relationship between China and the world, China and the United States. And in recent days also the UK and the US trade relationship. So one of the things we're going to get into is where are attitudes on trade? Why are we where we are? Did we promise too much? Did we explain? Are we very good at communicating and explaining on trade? Is that part of the problem? Are we very good at helping people see the benefits or not? And have the structures that we put in place, things like bilateral, multilateral trade agreements, are they the right way to go? Global trade agreements like first the GATT and then its successor, the WTO, the rules-based trading regime. We're also going to want to talk about China in particular, because I think it is, as a topic on its own, it's unique. We have never seen in the history of the world a single country emerge on the global economic scene, with as big a presence as China has in recent years. And did we anticipate that well? Are we prepared for it now? And then I also want to make sure that we do talk about things like the changing nature of trade, in particular the digital space, and how we think about data and digital trade as well. We're fortunate to have a really wonderful panel here to talk about it, and just incredible experience. I'm not going to read long bios. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about them. If I were to read all of their bios, we would have nothing else to talk about today except getting through their bios, because they have just such deep experience. But on my immediate left is Ben Digby from Confederation of British Industry, longtime trade director, international trade leader at CBI. It used to be said that the sun never set on the British Empire. The sun never sets on the interests of CBI. You have teams in India and China, sort of around the clock interest in thinking about the interest of British trade,
and the US and Brussels,
and the US and Brussels as well. So you really
don't forget those.
Truly are global, and that's because some British firms are some of the most successful global firms. Was involved in TTIP and the EU Canada agreement, and we'll have a lot of opportunity to talk about Brexit as well. Janice Charette, High Commissioner of Canada to the UK. Long experience in Canadian government, so here involved with UK-Canadian relations that include a great deal on the commercial relationship and the trade relationship. Long experience in Canadian government. You worked for 8 different ministries, which I think is fascinating, not because you deal with 8 different problems, but in some cases you deal with some of the same problems, but from a different perspective, which is a really great way to think about problem solving. And I think when one of those is trade relationships, and so we're looking forward to your experience on that. Next to Janice is Gil Kaplan. Gil is the the Undersecretary for International Trade at the U.S. Commerce Department, a longhand in trade attorney, worked on trade disputes, on trade deals. Goes back to 1983 in the Reagan administration, working on things like semiconductor disputes with Japan. So very, very big, complex trade. In fact, I don't think I think all of us will admit that Gil is going to have the most depth on the details of and intricacies of individual trade agreements and trade law and trade disputes. So very lucky to have Gil here as well. And then Ambassador Ron Kirk. Although I like to call you Mayor, Ron Kirk. That's my favorite title for you is Mayor. So Ambassador Kirk was he was the U.S. trade representative through U.S. government in the first half of the Obama administration. He heads up the global trade practice at Gibson Dunn, now a recognized leader on an important voice on trade. One of the reasons and I worked at the U.S. Senate. You worked in state government in Texas also. But mayor, I think, is really important for a global city like Dallas. He was the mayor of Dallas, where, again, more than all of us in a lot of ways, you're on the front line of people dealing with globalization, firms dealing with it's one of the world's great headquarters of globally active firms is Dallas, and you're on the front line of NAFTA in Texas, so dealing with all of the those various issues as well. And so very fortunate to have you here. Thank you, Mayor. I wanted to start our discussion with this first question I posed about the discontent on trade and whether we have done a good enough job of explaining it and helping people understand it. And the way I think about it is we've all worked on trade agreements, and it occurred to me that every time I would go work on a trade agreement, there were certain political people who would tell me, never talk about imports. Right? We should only talk about exports. You'll hear this statistic, which we've all said many times, at least in the United States, we say, the U.S. represents 5% of the global population. That means 95% of our market is outside, so let's talk about opening markets and exports, but never talk about things coming in. We don't never really talk about the disruptions of trade, and trade done properly by its very nature ought to be disruptive. That's in some ways the point of it, to get more competitive firms and to bring greater products into countries for both consumers and businesses. Have we failed on that? Have we done a poor job of setting expectations? Is that part of the discontent on that? And Ron, because you were someone who had to go to talk to citizens and ask them for their vote on certain things, can I ask you to address that first?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is yes, we failed miserably. It is our own fault. It is unfortunately the one area there is bipartisan embracement of the principle that a great way to get elected president of the United States is to blame every lost job, every closed factory on trade, and commit that you're going to do it. And so this is not a recent phenomenon. I'm quick to remind people I was appointed U.S. Trade Representative by then Senator Barack Obama, who got elected in a fierce primary with then Senator Hillary Clinton in a battle basically over who would redo NAFTA. Now, some of this is because of our political map in the United States, that the reality, our elections come down to, you mentioned, Tony, you were mentioned in Pittsburgh, and you were kind enough to reference my time as mayor of Dallas. But I tell people the most useful skill set and mindset I brought to me as trade rep is that my wife's from Cleveland and Detroit. And so I had to deal very early with the reality. Not everybody looked at trade as the job-creating value proposition that people in places like Texas and Kansas do, and that we had to redo that. And I will stop quickly, but I mean, our biggest challenge, the benefits of trade are wonderfully diffuse. We all benefit from them in the way we eat, the way we educate our kids, the way we buy, but they are so spread out, we take them for granted. But the pain is very localized. And so when people see that factory closed, and whether it's related to trade or not, and you blame it on that, then everyone can see and identify with that. And so one of the challenges that I embraced as USTR was to talk about trade in a different way, to go to places like Pittsburgh and Detroit and find out what their concerns were, and then try to confront those up front. But if trade is going to have the benefit we want it to have long term, particularly in developed economies like the US and here in the European Union, we have to demonstrate a value beyond what people perceived as it just being a facilitator of shifting jobs from the developed world to the developing economy.
Janice, is it a developed world thing? I mean, saying the same in Canada, the same sentiments in Canada as well?
I think I would come to the same conclusion that I think communications is still a big challenge for us. But I think Canadians start from a slightly different position. We're a very small country in a big geography. 64% of Canada's geography, 64% of Canada's GDP depends on trade. So Canadians tend to be biased in favor of open markets and free trade. That is part of, I think, the economic mindset in the country, but it's not universal by any stretch of the imagination. And we see that at the time when free trade negotiations are underway or free trade legislation is going through parliaments. And I mean, trade, I remember when I first started into the trade business, I came at this, as you said, from other different angles. From different subject matter areas. But I found this was a world of acronyms and experts, right?
Green boxes and amber boxes.
Uruguay and blah, okay. But what does it all mean at the end of the day? What does it mean to workers and consumers? Can we tell a story about how consumers are going to have better choice and maybe lower cost? And that actually, yes, there are some regions that are going to see job losses, but there is going to be job gains. So I think part of our approach on this in Canada has been to try to include people more in the process of getting ready for trade negotiations, be more inclusive in the trade negotiations process. There's obviously a trade-off here. Not everybody's sitting at the table. That's implausible. But a better job of outreach to industry stakeholders, industry associations. In the last round of negotiations in the USMCA, the government put a big focus on having a multi-party advisory committee, so this didn't try to neutralize the partisan elements of all this. We'll see how that works when the legislation comes through. But it's been a really important part. The other thing is a suite of domestic policies to try and deal with, how do we reskill people who are affected by job changes as a result of trade agreements? How can we deal with, the infrastructure requirements as evolving trade patterns happen? I guess my last point, and I'll stop here, is that the other reality is that part of what we're seeing in terms of the economy on a global basis is due to changing trade patterns. and globalization. But there's a lot of it that's due to technology and technological change and the impact of automation. And I think those things are being commingled. And maybe that's just a reality and we're going to have to deal with that. But I think that we got to make sure we're fixing the right problems with the right solutions. And I think that that's part of the communications challenge for certain.
Ben?
I was just really struck by your comment about trade feeling cool, and I think it does here. But if you're versed in what Janice has described, the language of acronyms and expertise, you've suddenly got probably people in this audience with 30,000 Twitter followers being called up in front of the select committee, the podcast, all of that sort of stuff. But let's not mistake that for not having some way to go with the general public. And if I can just share a short story about our experience as an organisation during TTIP. So we were called down to Bristol in the southwest of England to meet a mattress manufacturer, and we were told by our local team down there that he wanted to talk to us about TTIP. So we went down and we said, we're here to talk to you about TTIP. And he said, I don't want to talk about that. This is trade policy, this is Westminster, it's Whitehall, let me talk to you about my business. So we sat down with him and he said, look, the biggest challenge I have in my business is that my biggest export markets are Europe and the United States. I make mattresses. One set of health and safety regulations in Europe, one set of health and safety regulations in the United States. I'm having to burn a mattress every time to go through the health and safety checks. How can you fix that? And we said, yeah, we're here to talk to you about TTIP. This is what trade policy is all about. But if the challenge is there with a business which is actually trading overseas, and the idea that the general public versed in trade, I think is, we got some way to go there.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you've ever tried going down the pub and talking about CPTPP.
I have. Yeah.
I don't recommend it. We got a long way to go.
Well, so I've essentially said, Gil, that that we have a communications problem. Obviously, I think we do have a communications problem. Part of that is part of it is not having the right language to you're not going to do talk about Ricardian comparative advantage theory in that pub, right? And it's not that people aren't capable of understanding it, but we shouldn't force people to study trade texts in order to understand what's happening in their lives around them. But Gil, it's more than a communications problem. The disruption of trade, as you've seen and been on every side of over the past few decades of dealing with some of the disputes that we have in trade. Those are fantasies. They're real. There are real problems with trade, as we always have. I always said the first paper I ever wrote on trade was about Canadian softwood lumber back in the 80s.
Oh my God!
And we're still dealing with Canadian softwood lumber issues, right? It hasn't gone away. So there are issues, and we have to deal with them. But is it more than communications?
Yeah, I think it is. But as I mentioned, before I start, I just wanted to, as a federal government official, say a word in honor of George H.W. Bush. Tomorrow is a day of mourning in the federal government. We're closing, and I'm here, and I just felt I should acknowledge him and his contribution. I worked for him for 5 years. I was a deputy assistant secretary for most of that time. He was vice president, so it wasn't like we hung around every day. But he was a tremendously positive force in the Reagan administration, highly respected. He ate lunch every week with Ronald Reagan as a confidential advisor. As far as I know, the substance of those lunches never became public. And he was someone who President Reagan could trust wholeheartedly, confide in without fear, and I think that was a tremendously helpful thing for the entire United States government. So I just wanted to say a word in honor of him before I get started on international trade.
Thank you for doing that. Can I tell just one quick story? We used to, when I was mayor of Dallas, we hosted an international forum to pay for our international outreach, and we would get a speaker to come. And so we took advantage of the fact, with President Bush being from Texas and after he'd come back, to have him be our headliner. And the week before our luncheon, it was the largest ever, so loud, he decided then at 70 years old to jump out of an airplane again, his first experience as a paratrooper, and we had an incredible amount of anxiety. Please don't hurt this man. But he was, we got to also see that side of him that was just the side that people now celebrate, just a wonderful example of humility and love for family and love for country. And so I just wanted to add that. Thank you for doing that.
Sure. You know, I've heard before that the problem with trade is a lack of communication about the benefits of trade. I don't know about that. I think people have heard the benefits. It's certainly been discussed by many of our prior presidents and leaders. I think the problem is we're not looking realistically in the United States at some of the negative aspects of trade. I think we are now. I think we had a $566 billion trade deficit last year. We have an enormous trade deficit with China. What that means is obviously a lot of products, billions of dollars of products are coming into the United States and displacing production in the United States. Now there's another side. Obviously our exports are very large and they're critical to many industries, many workers, many farmers, many ranchers. But those products that are coming in, and they're all across the board, they're obviously steel, they're high technology products, they're solar panels, they're all kinds of chemicals and other manufactured goods are hurting US companies and workers. And they probably wouldn't mind it so much if it wasn't eminently clear that they are being traded unfairly in many ways, and we are being kept out of these foreign markets through practices that violate the WTO, violate American law, and violate common norms of behavior. So we need to deal with those issues if we want trade to be popular and if we want to communicate the benefits of trade. Before we can really get very far with that, we have to deal with these issues, and that's what we're trying to do in the Trump administration.
You've been able to, so the president was in, at the G20, came out with an agreement to talk with the Chinese, and we also have the USMCA on the table. Could you talk a little bit about where you expect those to go?
Well, I'm looking forward to this 90-day period. I think that has been established in the meeting between President Xi and President Trump. I think there's a possibility of some real progress. Obviously, the president does, and I think the whole administration will be working very hard to make that a reality. I think the USMCA is a great agreement. There's a lot of improvements over the NAFTA. We have great intellectual property improvements. We have data protection for 10 years. We have more access for dairy in Canada. We have auto rules of origin and domestic or USMCA content rules, which should help a great deal with respect to autos. I think it's going to be a very exciting agreement. We have to get it through the Congress, but from my soundings, I think that'll be done, and I think it'll be an excellent first new free trade agreement for the Trump administration, and will act as a paradigm for the other agreements we're trying to do with the UK and the EU and Japan and hopefully other countries.
I might want to get into some of those and how much the USMCA might be a model for those other agreements too. What's the view in Canada on USMCA?
I think that this will be the third trade agreement that's going to come before the Parliament in Canada for ratification since the election of Prime Minister Trudeau and his government. So the first one that came through for ratification was Canada-EU, then the CPTPP, which has been ratified in Canada, and now USMCA. I think that, I wouldn't surprise anybody by saying probably the happiest thing about the USMCA is that we have an agreement between Canada with the United States and Mexico. This is an existential economic relationship for Canada, and it's really, really important for us to have a shared economic agenda, a framework for fair, free, and open trade between Canada and our most important economic partner to the south. So there is a lot of support for the agreement in Canada. Obviously, every trade agreement, and I think this is an important note, goes back to the communications point. Every agreement has trade-offs in it. And you just named some of the things that probably won't be at the top of the press release. But the reality is, for Canadian auto manufacturing, it's important to have a known set of rules under which, our our very integrated market operates. And there's other portions of the agreement, including some of the trade remedies, which are also an important ingredient for Canada. As we look at a world right now where some of our broader multilateral fora, like the World Trade Organization, just don't seem to be working in a way where people feel like you can rely on those mechanisms. It's important to have these in our bilateral and our multilateral trade agreements to fall back on.
Can we actually? I definitely want to get into that, and especially how the WTO is working. I think there's a lot to, or not working in certain cases. But one thing that struck me about, I think you mentioned the third free trade agreement that you've had to put before Parliament, the TPP, but also the U.S.
CETA and USMCA.
And CETA, which is really, I think, a groundbreaking trade agreement. It's very innovative. But one of the things that struck me about that was the requirements for Canada to do work on its internal market also, and improving. And so there is this thing about trade agreements that require countries to do their own internal reforms, sort of outside pressure. We're seeing it with Abe in Japan. We've certainly had to do it in the United States from time to time. But how is that going in Canada?
I'd say that we're making more progress on our external trade relationships than our internal trade relationships, but that's something that the governments of Canada are actually trying to tackle. The devil is in the details. And the barriers that can creep into trade in services or in goods between provinces and territories in Canada can be quite hard to actually pinpoint, and actually hard to try and figure out how you get to resolving them. But there's a political will to actually be able to tackle them, and I think in some occupations we've made progress to removing barriers for people to be able to practice their trade. For instance, if you have a particular kind of a recognition of your plumbing credential, you can plumb anywhere in Canada, as an example. But I still can't bring wine from Ontario into Quebec without risking getting wine seized at the border. Not that there is a border between Ontario and Quebec. I can't import beautiful British Columbia wines to my home in Ontario, and I look forward to the day when I can do that.
We have the same problem in the United States, actually. We're not exactly the most open market for wine internally either, but so maybe we could work that out of a trade agreement.
Would you like to buy some British Columbia
Yes,
wine?
absolutely. It might be easier to buy British Columbia wine than certain California
We can
wines.
talk about that.
Okay.
That'd be great.
Tell me before
Yeah.
we leave that, though, because Janice did mention of the three agreements that they're going to ratify. The other was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and one I applaud, particularly the very good work that Ambassador Bob Lighthizer did to get us a new, and I can't forgive me, I'm from Texas, NAFTA 2.0. But so this doesn't just feel like you're great, we're all great club. I do have to note, for many of us though, we felt there was an incredibly missed opportunity because we basically had all of the elements of a modernized NAFTA agreement when the United States was a part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So while yes, you did do good work, I don't know that we are to be applauded for sort of starting a fire and putting it out and now wanting a parade, when what we essentially have done is really put U.S. exporters behind a non-competitive position to now the 11 other countries that are going to reap the benefits of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the United States is on the outside. And we started out talking about whether we've done a good job of giving its benefits, and I think you gave a good response to that. But one of the other complaints we got, given the reality that the overwhelming majority of exporters in most countries are small businesses. They're not Boeing, they're not the large companies. For them having to try to figure out the details of all these bilateral agreements is just a spaghetti bowl of regulations. And so I am concerned that we have lost that competitive benefit, and even going about it the way that we're going about it puts an extraordinary amount of pressure on exporters to now try to rationalize since you were talking about that bit. What are the rules if I want to go to Europe? What are the rules if I'm gonna go here? So
There is a question on this on some of the with the direction trade agreements are going, Gil. Which I want to ask both Ben and Gil to address this. Is that are they in fact making the globally active firms in those countries, in our case of USMCA in North America, the case of UK companies leaving the relationship with the EU in a more or less competitive situation globally? And so I take your point on things like rules of origin in the USMCA, but if you're a globally active firm producing for a global market and you are competing against firms that do not have domestic content requirements imposed on them, are you in a more or less competitive situation? Will auto companies be better off exporting out of North America today than they will be under the new USMCA? And firms operating in the UK leaving this special relationship with the EU, better or worse relationship or ability to export?
Well, that's a very complex question, I think, that would vary by...
That's our life in trade.
Vary by company and industry. I think the biggest part of my job is actually export promotion. We have 100 offices about in the United States and 70 worldwide, really 200 total. And it's called the Domestic and Foreign Commercial Service, where we assist United States companies export everywhere in the world. And our job is to break down the barriers, to advise them on the nuts and bolts of exporting. And there is so much enthusiasm for exporting. I think that though there may be some issues for some companies based on the structure of a particular trade agreement, I think there's tremendous possibilities. And you look at so many great U.S. companies that are exporting all over the world in so many industries, semiconductors, large earth-moving equipment, all kinds of services, internet companies, which are incredibly successful everywhere in the world to the extent that everybody now wants to tax them. I think that those issues are very important that you mentioned for equalizing trade within the area where the trade agreement occurs, but they're not impeding U.S. companies on their exports. All that being said, there are a very limited number by percentage, a very limited size of U.S. companies that export. It's in single digits or maybe even 1 or 2%. So it's something we're working on very hard at Commerce to increase.
I definitely want to get into that, but I want to Brexit also.
I think in relation to the UK-EU relationship, the honest answer to your question is that we don't know yet, and we're not going to know in 8 days' time because the vote is really on the withdrawal agreement, and we won't really know until we get into the negotiation. It's going to be after March next year. We've then got European parliamentary elections. We're not going to know the future of the relationship for a long time, so you can't pass judgment on that for the moment. I mean, the truth is, though, that one of the reasons why we have been very supportive of a very close relationship with the EU and talked about the importance of frictionless trade is that CETA is a great relationship for Canada, but the truth is that if we have that with the UK, it takes us further apart. And I can tell you that going around the country talking to companies who have been trading just with Europe and not outside, you talk to them about rules of origin requirements and they don't know what you're talking about. And that's a huge challenge for us, is that we've got a large number of companies, even the companies who've been trading internationally just with the European Union, who aren't particularly educated and informed on trade.
Yeah. But Tony, I do have to interject just to mess it up, is that at least for the last 20 years, the United States, collaboratively with Canada, the European Union, Japan, and others at the WTO, have worked to lessen local content requirements and others because they run against the grains of the sort of foundations of what you want an open, competitive market to be. And so, I mean, again, I understand why we did it in the U.S., but my concern is for a very long time, the world has at least looked to the United States and the European Union to be at the vanguard of open markets, defending those principles. Once we retreat from that, other economies are going to define that in a different way. And then it sort of, in my mind, becomes a self-failing principle, of, just like this tariff war, which I have to know, but I have to mix up with you a little bit since we only defined this in the deficit. The trade deficit has exploded under President Trump, even with all these tariffs going into effect, because it does not work to bring about the sort of liberalization that we want. So I agree with the diagnosis of the problem. I think we have to be smarter about how we go about trying to solve that. But all you have to do is look over the last 50 years. Those economies that have embraced open markets, competitiveness, invited innovation, generally have outperformed those that go the other way.
I think that's, in a way, that's my fear, right? Is not that other countries are going to copycat on things like rules of origin. It's that they won't.
Yeah.
Right? They actually allow themselves to be a little bit more efficient that way.
Maybe just
Well, can I respond to
Yes.
that?
Yeah, anytime you're directly,
We have to have a little bit of fun.
I think
we encourage it. We encourage it. Yeah.
I think the tariffs, both for steel and aluminum and with respect to China, were necessary steps we had to put on to try to make progress on these issues or to protect our national security. And I think that some of them can certainly...
But Gil, I don't think anybody believes that putting a tariff on cars from Europe or Korea was a threat to the U.S. national security.
Canada.
Jump in there.
Well,
I mean, I get you, but I mean,
you're going not to what's in the past, but you're going into the auto.
well, look, I didn't
232.
propose those tariffs, but when you said national security, I mean,
Well, I was referring to steel and aluminum, but all I can really say about autos and 232 is there's an investigation underway. We're looking at these issues, and the statutory deadline is February 19,
so the last 50 years
2019.
we've been driving all these cars and that. Okay,
Well,
I can't help it. I have to do.
I think we're looking at those issues, and we're going to come to a conclusion on it.
Yeah, the Canadians are coming. We better
Janice.
get ready.
So I won't persist in the steel conversation. That's an active conversation going on between our countries, but it is hard to understand how that becomes a national security issue between two countries that are so close. But Canada, I think, has taken with these agreements. Canada is now the only G7 country that has a free trade agreement with every other G7 country. If you're sick of hearing that, I'm sorry, we're going to keep saying it because that for us is the answer to your question. I mean, the reality is having in place those kinds of bilateral and multilateral agreements, we think provides the best reciprocal approach to open markets and free trade with a common set of rules where we can actually then trade with preferential access based on the rule of law and not the law of the jungle. And that's up to the best interest of not just Canadian exporters, but workers and consumers. And we know exactly what you said. Trade leads to better productivity, better investment, better wage growth. Our big challenge is, as you said as well, not enough Canadian businesses are in the export business, and a lot of them, those that are exporting into the United States. And so our government has set an objective, a very ambitious objective of diversifying our export trade over the next 7 or 8 years significantly, and is putting the resources into organizations such as yours, Trade Commissioner Service, to try and help companies to understand the nature of the opportunities. Having a trade agreement's it's kind of the end of the beginning. Having a trade agreement is nice, but actually exporters understanding the nature of those opportunities and being supported to access those markets, that's where the real love happens.
Can I answer just one quick thing on steel? I know we are...
You know you're not in a room that loves the steel and aluminum tariffs.
Well, let me just
That's
say,
no surprise to you.
I want to say, and I don't want to get deeply into any particular country because people are looking at various issues, but I think that it's critical to understand that the reason we put the tariffs on was to ensure that the capacity utilization in steel and aluminum would be at about 80%. And we felt we needed to do that to keep those industries vital in order to make sure they could contribute to the national security of the United States. And that national security of the United States isn't only important to the United States, but to all our close allies who depend on us greatly. And if you look at the kinds of products we need to have a strong national security, you certainly need a strong steel industry and a strong aluminum industry. That's why we felt we needed to have this capacity utilization in these two industries to keep them strong and keep them varied so they could make all the kinds of steel and aluminum that are necessary for that military equipment supply chain.
One of the things, if we look at the past, 15 or 20 years, when we think about our economies, right? Our economies have had, if we're talking about trade between U.S., UK, Europe, and the United States, Canada, Mexico, these trade agreements, we've been at it for a while. They're actually fairly mature. I will say, going through an election campaign where people are talking, about blowing up NAFTA. We have NAFTA. I would say I was a big fan of old NAFTA. I would say that USMCA is, I used to say NAFTA is the best trade agreement ever negotiated, and would dispute that when the president would say the opposite of that. But I would say that USMCA is the greatest trade agreement negotiated had NAFTA not existed, right? Still, it's a really high quality. There are things in it that we can point to. I don't like the rules of origin and some of the wage issues, but overall it needed some modernization, and that's probably a good thing. But the biggest thing that's happened over the past couple decades was not that relationship. It really the oncoming of China over the past 20 years and its role as a very, very significant manufacturing hub. Whatever we think about national security on steel in particular as a sector, we do hear a lot in the United States, and we hear it in other economies, the question of national security interest with respect to China. Some of their practices on intellectual property, on technology transfer, on their different views of the firm in their economy that's different from us. So I know you're going to start these negotiations. The question we would have is this the best strategy, the U.S. taking this on, or is there a pathway to doing it in cooperation with the other economies who feel the same way, by the way, about China? I'm going to turn and put that to you, Gilbert. I want to ask the others too about how the U.S.-China relationship and this dispute is impacting your decisions as well.
Well, I think given that we're starting this new effort right now, I'm going to be pretty limited in what I'm going to say. I think these talks are scheduled down during this 90-day period, and I look forward to some positive results. I think other countries have expressed concern about the same thing, and hopefully, if we achieve some results, it'll be things which our allies are also hopeful about.
Will China always be fundamentally different that way in the way their firms operate and their relationship with the Chinese government?
So, yes, but can I make a comment? You asked about how are British companies impacted by all of this, and I think it feels slightly like we're caught in a crossfire. I guess is the best way of putting it. I actually, in advance of coming here, was having a conversation with a managing director of a big British global manufacturing business. I won't name them, but they manufacture in China and export into the United States. And he said, for me, we're obviously impacted by the tariffs. We don't take a political view. We're a business. We can adjust. But what it does is create a huge amount of uncertainty about what to do about it. Because, frankly, you're having to spend a lot of time looking at where the tariffs fall, and that's added time, management time, doing that and making sure that you're compliant. But it's also thinking about how long are these tariffs going to be in place, and what should my business decisions be? And he said to me, look, I can move my manufacturing. I can move it into Vietnam. I can move it somewhere else to avoid the tariffs, but I don't really want to make that decision if the tariffs come away in the next 2 to 3 months. So I think they can understand the reasons, and I think it's absolutely true that British companies and European companies understand the diagnosis of some of the issues about doing business in China, but it creates a whole load of uncertainty approaching it in this way.
It's impossible for any of these firms. We had a big dispute in the last few weeks with the decisions by General Motors, right, to close some plants in the United States. General Motors produces more cars in China than they do in the United States. That's going to continue. It's it's an enormous market. They're going to be selling 30 million cars a year in China. That is an equation I think every large trading firm needs to account for, that you need to be in China in a big way because the market is so big and growing. Is that right, Ron? I mean,
it is, but and I want to.
It creates conflicts for them also.
Well, a couple of observations. One, and because I've been, I think, not bashful in saying where I disagree with the Trump administration, but China is a challenge and has been a challenge, particularly on those areas the Trump administration has laid out. They want to see progress. And so I am in total agreement with attempts to say to China unequivocally, you cannot build a long-term competitive society on the theft, appropriation, copying of U.S. technology, innovation, or forcing, whether it's companies from the United States or the UK or Canada, to turn over technology to them. And that has to end. But I also believe long-term that we have to be shrewd enough in how we engage China on that so that China can, in their own way, save face with their constituents and say, here's why we are improving our intellectual property regime. And to your question is, could that be better done sometimes when it's not just a U.S. president pounding on the table, but it is maybe perhaps in the context of the WTO, as we did before with typically it's everyone but China. It's the United States, the European Union, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, doing that collaboratively. But more importantly, slowly, China is developing its own innovative class. And those innovators, those entrepreneurs are beginning to make the argument to China, why the hell do we want to invest all of these billions of dollars in building a technology that you're just going to let someone steal from us? So I just want to make sure that we use all the tools that we have in our toolbox to engage that. And on autos, again, I think it's just too easy to say, General Motors is building cars in China. Well, you know what? Mercedes-Benz is building cars in the United States. And Korea's building cars. Because the auto industry basically decided it's cheaper to build cars. Where are you going to sell them? And that's not going to change. And one of my final point about, I think, the uselessness of tariffs is the global supply and manufacturing chain is so complex now. Those businesses do have the ability to do just as you said, Ben. And so you end up with the counter effect of what you wanted. Those jobs end up going to another market, singularly to avoid a tariff rather than another rational business decision. But on China, I think the more we can surround them, try to bring them into the norms, the better it is. And again, I think one of the, at least for the United States, one of the opportunities lost was so much of what we're preaching that's good was embedded in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that ultimately I think China is going to become a part of, and then they would have had to embrace all those principles that are now embedded in that agreement.
Can I just add one point to that? Because the only other thing that I would say is that I do think that now is the right time to be very direct and vocal with China. It's 40 years since the start of the economic reform process under Deng Xiaoping. I think China wants to do something. I think it feels like it needs to show that it's opening up now, this year. And if you can find a way of doing that where China feels like it's doing it on its own terms and saving face, then now is the right time to be doing it. So I'm not completely.
Yeah, I actually think there's broad agreement on the goal, and there may be issues with the strategy. But what would we want to see from what would WTO reform look like? What would your firms be interested in seeing? We were very frustrated in the Bush administration. We were frustrated for years because I think we've all been there where firms come and complain about China, but didn't want to file cases. They were worried about retribution. They were worried about sharing sensitive information and ruining their relationship in China. So we're seeing a little bit, the action I think is, forcing the action isn't a bad thing, but we need to be thinking about it globally. WTO is probably the place to do it. What would you want to see, and how optimistic are you that we can get something done at the WTO level? I'll start with you, Ben, if you're ready. Yeah.
Well, if I may, I would actually quite like to hear what Janice says about this, because I think that Canada has shown some amazing leadership. I was in Ottawa 6 weeks ago, so now just ahead of the big meeting of the WTO ministers. So I'd love to know where you think that's got to.
So, as Ben said, our Minister for International Trade and Diversification, Jim Carr, chaired a big meeting in Ottawa towards the end of October, bringing together countries who wanted to talk about reform of the WTO. And I think there's all kinds of reasons why we can say it's not working very well. But what are we actually going to do about it, and where is their collective will to actually take action? So they actually looked at, some immediate things that could be done to try and improve the system. A lot of focus on how do we make the dispute settlement process work, because I think that's an area where it isn't working to the satisfaction of really anybody at this point in time. And what can we actually do to get the WTO back in the negotiations business? But for me, it's a bit of a metaphor for a bigger set of changes in a world. I don't know how many of you were able to sit in the lunch presentation, the lady with the facts, but going from 1114, a number that will stick with me forever, like Americas, Europe, Africa are all 1, and then Asia's 4, and we're going to go to a world where Americas and Europe are going to be like we're slowly going to be or quickly going to be a smaller voice in the world. And so how do we adapt some of our institutions that were created at the end of the Second World War, Bretton Woods institutions, WTO institutions? How do we actually adapt it to a world where we're seeing shifting population power? Along with that is going to go economic and political power, and we're not all liberal democracies sitting around that table right now. So how do you make a multilateral trade forum work where that's not table stakes when you come into the conversation?
Yeah. We are getting very close to the end. I'm gonna put one question to each of you, or one question, if I could ask to get your views on it, and to see if we're here. If I take the 90-day clock and the Brexit,
The end of Brexit.
the end of Brexit, so it gets us both somewhere in the range of February or March 2019. So the question I'll ask you is: has the UK actually Brexited, and has the United States triggered the tariffs or not when we're at the end of this 90-day roughly period?
I thought I was going to get through a panel discussion without being asked about Brexit. That was wishful
It's
thinking.
impossible. Yeah.
I think we will leave at the end of March, but that is not the end of Brexit. I think Brexit is with us for some time to come after that, probably at least another 3, 4, 5 years.
And do you think the U.S. and China get enough progress that they do not trigger tariffs?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm just going to say yes.
Optimistic?
I'm a wishful thinker.
Okay. Janice?
An optimist.
So where's the UK going to be? We're believers that a strong UK and a strong EU and a constructive partnership between the two is ultimately what Canada is best interest of Canadian businesses and investors. A no-deal scenario is not good for businesses and investors, so some kind of arrangement, I think, is where we're very hopeful. The UK is Canada's largest trading partner in Europe, and so we are also doing what we need to do to make sure that we have the possibility for a seamless transition of our trade agreement in the event that it doesn't happen smoothly. And I'm in the world of, I hope so, on the China-US as well.
In terms of Brexit and the relationship between the EU and the UK, I leave that to the EU and the UK. But the one thing the United States would like to see is, if that does occur, that we are able to do a very good free trade agreement with the UK. That's our objective. I'll just say what Director Larry Kudlow said, it was yesterday or this morning, that we're hopeful that these talks with China will be fruitful.
I hope you're optimistic on that.
Pardon me?
I said I hope you're optimistic on that. I would like you to be optimistic on it.
I'm going to use an anecdote that I love from my career as a lawyer. Clarence Darrow was one of America's most famous trial lawyers around the turn of the century, had a wicked sense of humor, absolute contempt of most of the judges he went before. He was trying a case and just taking every opportunity to insult this judge that he could, and finally for the end of the trial. And the judge had held Clarence in contempt more times than you could imagine. The judge leaned over his bench and he said, "Mr. Darrow, one would hope that one is not impugning the intelligence and the integrity of this court." And Clarence Darrow's answer was, "Well, Your Honor, one can always hope, can't one?" So I'm going to leave it at that and say I'm going to be hopeful that we will see some progress in terms of whatever happens with the United States and China. But I look at it from a different way, because I do think some of the pain of these tariffs have begun to manifest itself in both economies. So if not because we've reached agreement, I do think there is enough evidence that what we're doing and working, that it would at least lend itself to further negotiations.
Thank you. I mean, thank you. First of all, thank the audience. Thank you all for coming. I wish we had an hour for maybe each of the things that we talked about. There's enough detail to go into them, and would have loved to get into U.S. UK trade agreement prospects in particular, among the others. But thank you to the panel for your contributions. Really wonderful. Wish you all great luck in fighting the battles on trade ahead. Thank you. Thank you.